It looked ordinary, a wedding photo taken in the year 1886, the kind of photograph families would hang in parlors or lock away in boxes to preserve a moment of joy. The bride, her face pale but touched with a faint smile, stood next to the groom, who looked proud and tall. His suit pressed his eyes fixed on the lens, and at first glance nothing seemed out of place. Nothing unusual, yet when this very photograph resurfaced decades later, it did not feel like a simple keepsake anymore. It carried with it an unease that settled into the stomach of anyone who dared to stare too long, because hidden within the frozen smiles was a detail that defied logic, a detail that historians would say never should have been there. The photograph was discovered in an attic belonging to the great-granddaughter of a local historian. She found it wrapped in a velvet cloth, the kind that smelled of damp wood and old smoke as she unwrapped it. The picture fell into her hands, and she felt a sudden chill, though the summer air outside was warm. She thought it was her imagination until her fingertips brushed the frame. It felt colder than iron. She set it down on a desk where light from the window caught its surface, and that was the first time she noticed the wrongness. The bride. Her faint smile had always been described in family tales as gentle, modest. But here the expression looked strained, like her lips were forced into a shape they did not want to hold the groom. His tall, proud figure seemed carved with too much intensity, his eyes darker than they should have been. And then came the detail that made her pull back in shock. Behind them, faintly, almost blurred, yet undeniable, was the outline of another figure. When historians were later called to examine the photo, they were divided. Some said it was merely a trick of light, a double exposure, a flaw in the glass plate. Yet others swore they could see clear features, a face long and thin, eyes hollow, and a hand reaching as if resting on the bride's shoulder. It was not the hand of the groom, and it was not the hand of any guest on the official record. Rumors began to spread that this was not the first time the photograph had unsettled its owners. Those who had seen it before claimed that the extra figure had not always been so clear, that with every passing year it seemed to sharpen, as if something within the photograph was growing more defined. More awake people whispered that this was why the photo had been hidden away in the first place, not lost, but intentionally sealed out of sight. The historians tried to explain it away. Yet one of them, an older man who had studied obscure folklore, felt a strange dread. He warned that objects sometimes hold more than memory. They hold presence. He said that if the figure was truly becoming clearer, then perhaps it was not trapped ink on paper. Perhaps it was something else. Something using the photograph as a window. The great-granddaughter could not shake the feeling that the photograph was watching her at night. She would lie awake in bed and swear she heard faint scratching like fingernails against glass when she finally dared to check the photo again. She thought the bride's eyes looked slightly different, more hollow, more knowing. She hid it once more, but the sound of scratching never left. The unease grew when local records revealed another detail at the wedding. In 1886, one guest had gone missing, a man whose name had been crossed out violently on the registry. His body was never recovered. The local gossip of that time whispered he had been taken as part of a pact, a debt paid for wealth or health or longevity, and some claimed the missing guest was the very figure that now appeared behind. The couple frozen in eternal witness. Those who studied the photo in person could never look for long. A strange pressure would build behind the eyes, a heaviness in the chest. One man described it as though the photograph was breathing, pulling him closer, urging him to look deeper into its shadows. Another woman who examined it swore the groom's smile widened each time she blinked. The photograph became more than history. It became a question of whether the past could still reach into the present, and if the couple in that frame had indeed made some kind of pact, what price had been paid, who had vanished to make way for their fortune. And why did the photo still carry the trace of it, after all these years? And yet the most unsettling thing was not the hidden figure nor the strange expression. It was the feeling that the photograph was incomplete, as if there was something else in the frame, something not fully visible waiting to step forward for the first time in over a century. So, when people stared too long into that wedding photo from 1886, they all admitted to the same impossible sensation it felt, not like they were looking at the photograph, but that the photograph was staring back at them. At that time, James Whitmore and Eleanor Gray were spoken of as the perfect match. People would stop on the street to watch them pass by. They were the picture of wealth, the essence of refinement. Their families had long been tied to land and influence, and their union was described as the weaving together of two powerful threads of society. James stood tall with the confidence of a man who knew doors opened for him without question, while Eleanor carried herself with a quiet grace, though her face seemed fragile as if weighed down by secrets unseen. Their engagement was not only celebrated, it was envied. Every household, from the poorest servant to the wealthiest merchant, whispered of the grandeur that their wedding would become. As the weeks led to the day of the ceremony, the town was charged with anticipation. Invitations were sent in cream envelopes embossed with the family seals. Every detail meticulously arranged. The banquet, the music, the attire, all whispered of elegance. Yet alongside the admiration, whispers of unease began to spread. People spoke softly of how Eleanor looked thinner by the day, her skin paling, her smile faint, her eyes holding a faraway distance as though she were listening to something no one else could hear. She was young, she should have radiated the bloom of life, but instead she seemed haunted, and when asked, she would say only that she was tired, though some claimed they heard her mutter under her breath, words that were not prayers, but something darker. Questions deepened. When it became known that James had refused the traditional church blessing, it was expected that families of such standing would hold their ceremony under sacred light before the altar, where vows were witnessed not only by men, but by God himself. Instead, James dismissed the idea, choosing rather a midnight ceremony in a small chapel at the edge of town. Only a few guests were permitted entry, their names never made public, their roles never spoken of, and the townspeople who waited outside, with lanterns, saw nothing but the flicker of shadows through stained glass and the faint sound of chanting that did not resemble hymns. Why midnight? Why secrecy? These questions troubled many, though none dared speak them aloud in the presence of James, for his temper was sharp and his influence sharp enough to silence any suspicion. Yet late at night, taverns carried the murmur that James had reasons rooted in old traditions not spoken of in polite society. Traditions where blessings were not asked of the divine but bargained from forces far older and less forgiving. On the night of the wedding, those who stood outside described a strange stillness in the air, the moon shrouded by clouds, the wind absent, the town clock striking 12 with a hollow ring. At that moment, the chapel doors closed and remained closed for nearly an hour. When at last they opened, James and Eleanor emerged, their faces unreadable, their clothes untouched. But there was a mark on James' cuff, a faint, dark stain that he claimed was wine, though none saw him drink and none dared to question further. Eleanor clutched his arm, her hand trembling slightly, her gaze not on the people but on something distant in the trees, as if watching for a signal. Only she could understand. What unnerved the crowd more was not what they saw, but what they felt. Those present spoke later of a heaviness in the air, as though the ground beneath them had exhaled and refused to breathe again. The silence was so deep that even the crickets seemed to vanish. The midnight sky hung heavy, and those who dared glance at the couple swore they saw a flicker of movement behind them inside the chapel. Though no one else was there, the following morning life in the town resumed. But something had changed. People avoided speaking directly of the wedding. Instead, they repeated fragments. Eleanor looked pale, too. Pale James seemed almost too alive, brimming with energy sharpness like a predator. Newly awakened servants whispered of strange smells that lingered in the clothes returned from the chapel, and others claimed they heard whispers within the walls of the Gray household, whispers that sounded like more than two voices when only James and Eleanor were home yet. For all these murmurs, the couple became untouchable. Their fortune grew overnight, business ventures thrived, land was acquired, servants multiplied, and their home gleamed with new riches, while those who had doubted them found misfortune, illness, or sudden accidents that silenced them forever. Coincidence, perhaps, but the town began to understand that the midnight ceremony had bound something far stronger than marriage. It had bound a pact. And still the questions lingered. Why did Eleanor look so pale? What did she give up that night when she stepped into the chapel? Why did James avoid the church blessing, as if he feared the light that might expose what he had done? People tried to ignore the answers, but deep down, they all knew. The truth was not lost, it was only buried beneath silence and shadows, and one day it would surface again. Because secrets sealed at midnight do not stay buried forever. They wait in the dark, and when the time is right, they return, staring out from photographs, from memories, from the very places we least expect them to, in the archives buried beneath. Dust and yellowed papers. An odd detail emerged when researchers searched through the fragile records of that fateful wedding among the neat list of attendees written in careful ink. One name stood out not because it was there, but because it was violently crossed out. The pen strokes were heavy, jagged, pressed so hard into the parchment that the fibers tore, and the ink bled like a wound across the page. It was not the hand of a scribe making a correction. It was the hand of someone who wanted to erase a presence as if striking out a soul. The name, though difficult to read, seemed to belong to a man not of great importance, yet not unknown. Either his family line was modest, his reputation unremarkable, but the violence with which his name had been erased told another story, a story whispered through the town for decades afterward. They said this man had attended the ceremony that night, had been seen entering the chapel at midnight, lantern in hand, his steps uncertain as though pulled into the gathering, by force or by a promise he could not refuse yet. When the chapel doors opened again and the couple emerged radiant and pale, the man was nowhere to be found. Local rumor grew like wildfire, claiming he had never returned home. His bed remained untouched, his belongings undisturbed, his horse still tethered to the post as if waiting for a master who would never come. Some said he had run away, abandoning his family. Others said he had been lured into the woods where no trace of him could be discovered. But those who lived nearest to the chapel spoke of another possibility, that his disappearance was no accident at all, that he had been chosen. It was not unusual in whispered folklore that sacrifices were hidden beneath celebrations. Old stories spoke of pacts sealed with the loss of a life given in exchange for prosperity, wealth, or power. The midnight timing, the secrecy of the guests, the refusal of the church, blessing all fit into a darker narrative, and the missing man became the centerpiece of that tale. But the strangest claim did not come from rumor alone. It came from the photograph itself, the very image that was meant to preserve the joy of the union for eternity behind the bride and groom. When one looked closely, when one dared to let their eyes adjust to the shadows, a faint outline seemed to appear, not a trick of the light, not a blemish of the plate, but a shape, a shadow stretching where no guest had stood. Some described it as a man's frame, tall, yet stooped as though weighted down. Others claimed to see eyes sunken hollow, fixed in sorrow or rage, reaching toward the bride's shoulder with a hand half-formed like smoke caught on glass. The shadow did not belong to James, nor to Eleanor, nor to any known guest. It matched instead the size and build of the man whose name had been crossed out. The chilling part was that accounts of the photograph changed over time. Those who examined it in earlier decades swore the shadow was faint, barely visible, a blur on the edge of perception. But later owners insisted it grew darker, sharper each year, as though the erased man was clawing his way back into existence, forcing his presence to be remembered, refusing to be silenced in both ink and image. Historians tried to argue the rational explanations, double exposures, flaws in preservation, or tricks of the eye, but the families who had possessed the photo knew better. Tragedy followed them. Fire, illness, madness, accidents that felt too deliberate to be chance, and always the shadow seemed to watch, growing clearer with each misfortune. There was even a tale from the grandson of a collector who had kept the photograph in his study. He claimed that at night he would hear footsteps pacing the floor, though no one was there. He described a figure in his dreams, the same thin, hollow man, reaching, always reaching. And when he finally dared to compare the dream to the faint shadow in the wedding photo, he swore they were the same. The collector died within the year the photograph passed on, so the story lived on of the guest whose name was violently struck out of history, erased from the record, yet immortalized in a far more terrible way, captured forever in the moment of the photograph. Not living, not gone, something in between his body. Never found his voice, never heard again, but his shadow lingering, as if waiting for justice or perhaps hungering for revenge. And that is why, even today, those who hear the story shiver, because they know that names can be erased from paper, lives can vanish without explanation, but shadows always return. And when they do, they remind us that nothing truly disappears. Not even the forgotten, not even the unwanted, not even the sacrifice. So, the question remains, what price did James and Eleanor pay for their union, and why was this man chosen? Was it chance, was it revenge, or was it part of the pact itself? Whatever the answer may be, his absence screams louder than presence. His silence echoes louder than words. And in the dark places of that photograph, the erased man is still there, watching, waiting, reaching out toward anyone foolish enough to stare too long into his shadow. The photographer, decades later, left behind a note that should have been routine, a technical explanation about light or exposure. Yet it became something darker, something that pulled fear into the hearts of anyone who read it. He wrote with a trembling hand that when he first developed the glass plate of the wedding photo, he noticed something strange behind the bride and groom. There appeared a third figure, faint, nearly invisible, like smoke lingering at the edge of vision. At first he thought it was an error, a double exposure, or dust on the plate. He told himself that his equipment had failed him, but the more he looked, the more certain he became. This was not a flaw. It was a face. The photographer was not a man prone to fantasy. He had worked with portraits for years. He knew the tricks of shadow and light. He knew how the chemicals sometimes produced ghosts that were not real. But this was different. This was consistent. This was deliberate. He swore that the figure was positioned directly behind the couple, too precise to be chance. And what unsettled him more was the expression, hollow eyes fixed on the bride, a hand half raised as if touching her shoulder, and the mouth curved into something that was neither smile nor frown, but hunger. In his note he described his attempt to erase it. He re-exposed the plate, washing it with chemicals, burning it with light, forcing the image to fade, yet each time he repeated the process, the figure returned clearer, sharper, as though it defied the act of removal, as though it wanted to be seen. And with every failed attempt, the figure came closer to the foreground, no longer distant, no longer faint, now standing almost between the bride and groom, as if claiming its place in the ceremony. He confessed that the more he worked on the photograph, the more he began to feel watched, not in the usual way, when a portrait captures the gaze of its subject, but deeper, as though the figure behind the couple was not bound to the plate, but reaching out from it. He claimed, at night he heard whispers in his dark room. whispers that sounded like a man repeating his name over and over until he was too afraid to enter alone. The note revealed that the photographer eventually refused to handle the image any longer. He delivered it to the family, claiming it was complete, though in truth he could not look at it again. He wrote that he felt the figure was alive, not in body but in presence, alive enough to know when someone was trying to erase it, alive enough to resist being forgotten. Historians who later found his note argued among themselves. Some said it was the rambling of an old man haunted by his own mistakes, but others pointed out that the style of photography he used left little room for such consistent flaws. The repetition of the figure, the sharpening of its form. Each time, this was not science. This was defiance, something that lived within the plate itself. What made the confession even more chilling was the detail he added at the very end. He claimed that on the last attempt, when he redeveloped the image for the final time, he saw something new. Not only the figure behind the couple, but eyes staring directly at him. Eyes that did not belong to James or Eleanor, but eyes that burned through the glass plate as if aware of who was trying to erase them. He dropped the plate in terror, shattering a corner and cutting his hand. And as the blood smeared across the glass, he swore the figure's mouth curved wider. From that day forward, he refused to take another wedding portrait. He shifted to landscapes and still life work. He became withdrawn. His family later said he rarely spoke of that night, but when he did, his words chilled them. He would say only that there are some faces that never wish to be erased, and that the photograph did not capture a memory. It captured a claim. And so the photograph passed from his hands to the family, and from the family to others. Yet every owner knew the same truth. The figure could not be erased. It grew clearer, stronger. It followed like a shadow that refused to let go, and each time someone tried to deny its presence, it only stepped closer. This is why the note matters. It is the testimony of a man who saw with his own eyes what others refused to believe. It is proof that the photograph is not passive, not history alone, but active, a force that resists oblivion, a reminder that some images are not taken. They are given, and what is given cannot be undone. So even today, when whispers of the cursed photo rise, when collectors speak of its last known location, they mention the note, the words that no one can shake. Each time the figure comes back closer, clearer, until at last it will no longer be behind the couple. It will be standing before them, staring at whoever dares to look. Hidden in a chest beneath moth-eaten cloth and the brittle scent of old wood, Eleanor's diary was discovered. Its cover cracked, its pages fragile, yet inside its words were sharp, alive, whispering from across time. What it revealed was not the tale of a bride preparing for joy, but the confessions of a soul entangled in something far more sinister. She wrote, not of dresses or flowers or music, but of voices, voices that she claimed came from the forest on nights when the wind fell silent. She described them as neither male nor female, but something in between, sometimes soft, sometimes harsh, always promising, always persuasive. They spoke of prosperity that would never end, land that would flourish, gold that would flow like water, health that would not wither in old age. They promised eternal prosperity. And at first, Eleanor thought herself mad. Yet the promises echoed in her life. Soon after, James' family business thrived. Mysteriously, debts vanished, land disputes resolved as if unseen hands cleared every obstacle. And Eleanor knew the voices were not mere dreams. The diary entries grew darker. She wrote that the voices did not only promise, they demanded. They spoke of balance, of exchange. They repeated again and again that something precious must be given in return, a debt that could not be avoided. The forest did not give without taking. She never wrote clearly what was asked, but her words trembled across the page, describing sleepless nights, where shadows crawled along her walls, where her reflection in the mirror smiled when her lips did not, where James looked at her with eyes that glimmered too bright, too knowing. She wrote of fear, She wrote that James did not deny the voices, he embraced them. She confessed that he had led her one night to the edge of the forest where the trees swayed. Though no wind moved, he told her to listen. She heard whispers that seeped into her bones, promising again eternal prosperity. And James said softly that they need only agree. She tried to resist, yet the forest seemed to breathe around her, pressing her closer to his words, and she realized James had already agreed long before she had known he had bound them both to the pact entry. After entry revealed her struggle. Sometimes she wrote in frantic lines, ink blotting the page as if her hand shook. She begged herself to flee, begged herself to tell someone, yet in the next entry her tone shifted calmer, colder, as though the voices had convinced her that the pact was inevitable, that resistance was foolish, that she would lose everything if she broke away. The diary became a war between fear and surrender, between love and dread, between her voice and the voices calling from the trees. Then came the final entry. It was shorter than the others, written with steady hand. Tomorrow the debt will be sealed. Those words stood stark, without flourish, without emotion, as if she had already resigned herself to what must happen. What debt, what price, she did not specify, but the implication hung heavy, like the echo of a funeral bell. Tomorrow, the wedding. Tomorrow, the sealing. Historians who read the diary shivered. Some claimed it was the ravings of a frightened bride. Others saw in it the blueprint of a pact older than scripture, a bargain whispered by forces that lived not in heaven nor in hell, but in the spaces between, hidden in forests, shadows, rivers, always asking, always waiting, always hungry. And when the diary was compared with the other accounts, with the missing guest, with the strange midnight ceremony, with the figure in the photograph, the pieces began to align. It was not coincidence. It was not madness. It was transaction. Eleanor and James had made a trade, and the wedding was not celebration. It was culmination. The chilling part was not only the pact itself, but the way her words lingered, her voice across time, as if the diary was more than record. As if it was warning. Some readers swore the ink seemed fresher than it should. The words pressing against their minds, whispering, not unlike the forest had whispered to her, promising prosperity. If only they would listen, if only they would believe. So the diary became not only a relic, but a temptation, locked away again, hidden by those who feared its influence, yet always resurfacing, always found, because debts do not vanish. They wait, they call, and the pact that Eleanor wrote of may not have ended with her. It may still echo, waiting for someone else to answer. Tomorrow the debt will be sealed. The wedding night was expected to be filled with laughter, with music, with the sound of glasses raised, and footsteps across polished floors. But instead the air was heavy, silent, unnatural. The guests whispered among themselves, wondering where the couple had gone for hours. James and Eleanor were absent from their own celebration. The torches burned low. The servants kept glancing at the doors, but no bride, no groom appeared, until someone muttered that they had seen them slip away toward the chapel at the edge of the grounds. Not the main hall, not the ballroom, but the old chapel, the one that held beneath it the crypt that had been closed for decades. Witnesses claimed the doors groaned when they pushed them open, a sound too heavy for wood alone, as if the very building resisted their entry. Yet they went inside with lanterns, and those who lingered nearby swore they saw shadows shifting behind stained glass, strange shapes that did not match human forms. Chanting rose, muffled at first, then clearer, and it was not the melody of hymns, not the rhythm of any prayer they knew it was. Lower, harsher, like words carried from a place deeper than earth. The hours dragged. The guests who had not been chosen to enter grew restless. Some left the grounds uneasy. Others stayed as if frozen by a sense that to leave was more dangerous than to remain. The bells of midnight had already passed. Yet the chapel doors stayed sealed until at last near dawn they opened and James and Eleanor stepped out, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. James carried himself as if renewed with strength, a vigor that unsettled those who looked at him too long, while Eleanor leaned heavily on his arm, her body trembling as if she had left something behind in the crypt. What struck the crowd most was the cuff of James' sleeve stained dark. He laughed when someone dared ask, claiming it was wine spilled during the toast. Though no one had seen a toast, no one had heard a single glass raised that night, yet the stain was too deep, too heavy, too close to the skin to be wine. It looked like something that had soaked into the cloth, something that clung like it wanted to remain. The chapel was locked the next day. The priest refused to speak of it. The church never opened that crypt again, as if sealing it would erase whatever had happened within. But the silence spoke louder than words. The guests who had been outside that night remembered the sound, the chanting, the way the ground seemed to pulse beneath their feet, as though the earth itself had been disturbed. And they knew something had been placed into that crypt, something that would never be spoken of yet, would never reach. Rumors spread quickly. Some said a sacrifice had been made, a life given to bind the union. Others whispered that James himself had struck a bargain and that the stain on his cuff was proof of the act. Not wine, not blood from a wound, but the mark of ritual, a sign of completion. There were those who claimed they saw a shadow linger behind the couple as they left the chapel, a shape that flickered against the walls, then vanished when the doors closed again. From that night forward, no one dared enter the chapel. Its windows grew dark, its walls damp ivy, covering its stones like a shroud. Children who wandered near swore they heard whispers from below, the ground calling their names in voices that sounded like their own, echoing back at them, and the elders would drag them away, warning never to return. What haunted the town most was not only the absence of laughter at a wedding that should have been joyous, but the sense that joy itself had been traded away for something else. James' fortune grew almost instantly. His ventures doubled. His land expanded. Those who crossed him suffered sudden ruin, accidents, illness, unexplained fires, while Eleanor withdrew, fading further each year until she was little more than a ghost in her own home. And people understood the truth, though they never spoke it aloud. Prosperity had been bought, and the price had been paid in the crypt generations later. When the chapel was examined by scholars, they found the crypt door sealed with iron chains, rusted but unbroken, as if someone had wanted not to keep people out, but to keep something in. No official record explained why the crypt had been abandoned. No burial listed, no ceremonies held. It was as if the church had erased the place from existence. Yet still the townspeople avoided it, crossing the street to keep their distance, lowering their voices when the wind carried the faintest sound of chanting. And always there was the photograph, the one taken that night, the one where James smiled too wide and Eleanor stared too far away in its corner. The shadow lingered sharper, darker with every passing decade, and many believed the shadow belonged, not to a man, not to a guest, but to whatever had joined them in that crypt, bound to them, bound to the photograph, bound to all who dared look too closely. The wedding night was never filled with laughter or music. Instead, it was filled with silence, with absence, with a promise sealed beneath stone. And though the years erased the details, the truth remained carved in whispers. Tomorrow the crypt may open again, and when it does, the debt will not only belong to James and Eleanor. It will belong to anyone who hears the voices that still call from beneath the ground. Every owner of the wedding photo met tragedy as if some invisible hand had marked the frame with misfortune. The first owner was a wealthy industrialist who displayed it proudly in his study. Yet within months, his factories caught fire one after another. Strange explosions claimed the lives of workers. No cause ever found. The man grew paranoid, pacing the halls at night, swearing he could hear faint whispers coming from the photograph. and on a stormy evening he vanished, leaving only a note that read, "I can no longer look at it." The second owner, a collector of rare antiques, purchased the frame at an estate sale, believing it was simply valuable art. Yet he soon began to claim that the bride in the photo followed him in the dark, her eyes moving though he swore no one else was present. At first he laughed at himself, telling friends it was a trick of light, a reflection on the glass. Yet every night he felt the gaze growing more intense, more accusing. He started locking his doors and windows at midnight, keeping the photograph under cloth. But even then, he described waking to feel the weight of her eyes upon him, the corners of her mouth almost smiling, or maybe mocking his attempts to hide it. The housekeeper left without explanation. The servants refused to enter the room, and he began to withdraw from society, refusing invitations, refusing meals, insisting that the bride was alive. In some sense, he could not comprehend until one morning he was found in his study, eyes wide open, dead, his expression a frozen mixture of terror and awe. The third owner, a young historian who believed the stories exaggerated, took the photograph home from an auction. Ignoring the warnings on the catalog page, he hung it on a wall in a room with little light. At first he thought nothing happened. Life went on yet. Slowly, small things began to unsettle him. Objects moved slightly, furniture out of place, minor accidents happening around him, yet he could not explain them. No one else seemed to notice the pattern until he too began to feel the bride staring at him from the photo, watching every movement, noting every breath, and the groom's smile began to change, growing wider, sharper, almost hungry. Some nights he thought the shadow behind the couple moved closer, growing bolder, asserting its presence. He tried covering the frame, tried storing it in a chest, but the photograph seemed to seep through cloth and wood. The presence never left. Neighbors reported hearing low laughter or faint cries in the room. At odd hours, a smell of burning paper or cold, damp stone sometimes pervaded the hallway. The historian's friends urged him to remove the photograph. Yet each time he tried, something unseen would cause papers to fly to the floor or lights to flicker, forcing him to stop and leave it hanging on the wall as if it demanded to be seen. He grew pale, his sleep broken by nightmares of the couple dancing in the dark with their unseen guest moving between them. He swore he could feel eyes on his neck, even when the frame was across the room by the time of the third owner's death. The photograph had earned a reputation so dark that no one dared touch it. The death itself was sudden, mysterious. A heart stopped without cause, a fit of madness perhaps, or the inevitable claim of the photograph. Whatever the truth, the frame remained intact, untouched under wraps in storage. Rumors swirled about who would inherit it, and all who came close refused the gift. Some fled towns, others refused the estate sale, fearing the same gaze that had consumed 3 lives. Already the bride and groom's figures in the photo seemed to thrive on attention and misfortune. Each new glance feeding the shadow that lurked behind the pattern was undeniable. Each owner met some calamity. Each tragedy escalated slightly. Each unseen motion in the photograph hinted at growing power. The town around them grew to whisper only in corners about the cursed frame. Some spoke of fire in old mansions, sudden death in bed, insanity striking like lightning, and even those who claimed skepticism could not deny the uneasy feeling in the pit of their stomachs when passing the place where the photograph was kept. And yet the photograph endured it, outlasted all who owned it. Each gaze captured in its glassy surface a warning and a promise. It was more than memory, more than art. It was alive, in a sense defying time and death, making its presence felt even across decades. The shadows of the couple and the hidden figure deepened in clarity. The more the photograph passed hands, and the more people suffered, the wider. The groom's smile grew, and the bride's eyes followed, with intent as if recording who looked, who dared, and who would next be claimed. So by the third owner, the photograph was no longer just a wedding portrait. It had become a legend, a curse, and an object of dread. Its history marked by tragedy, insanity, and fear, a silent witness to pacts sealed in darkness, to debts unpaid, to shadows that never rest. And the moment anyone considered touching it, they felt the pull, the gaze, the subtle movement that reminded them that this was not a picture, meant to be owned. It was a presence waiting, patient, eternal, unyielding. Local folklore says that James and Eleanor never aged like others, that as decades passed, their faces remained smooth, their bodies unbent by time or illness. It was as if they were carved from stone or painted into life. Yet the town around them changed, generation after generation. The trees grew taller, the roads cracked and crumbled. Their neighbors came and went, but James and Eleanor remained a constant presence, untouched. By years yet, their fortune grew with uncanny speed, wealth accumulating faster than any reasonable business could account for, estates expanding land, multiplying servants, obeying without question, and all who witnessed it felt the unnatural rhythm of their lives. But the prosperity had a price. Their children were not spared. The lives of the young ones were brief and fragile, each birth celebrated, yet each death mourned with intensity that left the town uneasy. The children who had been born, to them, seemed to carry shadows on their tiny bodies, weak from birth or succumbing suddenly to illnesses that baffled doctors. Whispers grew louder among the townspeople. What had James and Eleanor done to merit their own longevity while their offspring withered away? Why did the children suffer? So, and soon the story spread that the couple had traded blood for prosperity, love for power. A pact made in shadow that allowed them to flourish while those they brought into the world with them were doomed to vanish. And the photograph, the wedding photo taken all those years ago, became proof of their bargain, a witness captured forever. The bride and groom smiling in the image seemed almost to know something. The viewers could not. The hidden figure lurking behind them, a shadow of a man or a presence unbound, served as evidence of the unnatural pact. The image itself became a talisman, a record of the night in which prosperity was promised at a price, a night that shaped decades of tragedy and fear in the town, and every person who gazed at it felt the weight of what had been done. The eyes of the bride and groom burned into memory, watching, measuring, and the shadow behind them seemed to shift with every glance, as if acknowledging. Those who dared to observe, folklore describes children of other families growing up, noticing the eyes of James and Eleanor following them at gatherings, even when they were not near their home. Strangers reported that in certain lights, the couple appeared younger than memory recalled at town meetings. Elders whispered about the cost of greed and ambition, how the pact of the wedding night had left the photo as a silent sentinel. The photograph did not merely capture a moment. It captured intent, a consciousness, a warning that the prosperity and longevity enjoyed by James and Eleanor had been purchased with unseen suffering that echoes across generations. Some claimed that the couple would wander the forests late at night, their laughter soft and hollow, their movements precise like actors in a ritual, repeating a pattern. They could not break. Those who glimpsed them swore the shadows of their children followed invisibly, as if tethered to them by the bargain made so long ago, and those who studied the photograph noted subtle changes in the hidden figure. It was clearer, sharper, and sometimes in the corner of an eye seemed to move closer to the couple in the frame, affirming that the pact remained alive and the witness to it eternal. As the years stretched on, townsfolk who had encountered the couple whispered warnings to outsiders. Strangers dared not question the old tales. Yet curiosity drew some to find the photo themselves, and each who did reported sensations impossible to describe: a chill that sank into bones, eyes that seemed to move independently, a pressure on the chest, and the unmistakable feeling that the bride and groom knew when they were being watched, and the shadow behind them seemed to pulse with acknowledgement, almost alive, recording every reaction. So, the legend of James and Eleanor intertwined with their fortune, their children, their longevity, and the photograph itself became inseparable from the town's memory prosperity. At a cost, the visible signs of their wealth and youth, a constant reminder, and the proof hidden in a frame that held more than mere image. The photograph became a talisman of dread, a witness to a night when everything changed, a silent judge to a bargain made under moonlight, a record of a trade sealed with a debt paid in blood, and promises that no mortal was meant to understand. And to this day, when the wind blows through the old streets, when the fog settles over the town, the whispers return, reminding everyone that longevity can be unnatural, prosperity can be cursed, and the photograph still waits its eyes in shadow, watching, keeping record of all who remember, all who forget, and all who dare to look, knowing that the pact made long ago in shadow lives on, through James and Eleanor, untouched, unchanged, and their silent witness preserved forever in the frame. In 1974, the wedding photograph appeared suddenly in a secret auction in London, an event whispered about in hushed tones among collectors of the rare and the occult. Those who heard of it claimed the auction was not advertised openly. Invitations were sent discreetly sealed in envelopes that bore no return address. Only the most curious and daring bidders were allowed to enter the hall, a long, narrow room lined with velvet curtains and low, flickering chandeliers casting shadows that seemed to writhe across the walls. As if alive, the photograph was placed on a pedestal at the center, and the auctioneer warned those present not to stare too long, that the eyes of the bride and groom could weigh heavy upon the mind, and that the shadow behind them was not something that should be observed carelessly. Among the bidders was a journalist who had snuck in under the guise of an antiquarian. He carried a small notebook and a lantern, and as he observed the photograph, he swore he could see it move subtly as though the couple in the frame breathed, drawing the air around them into their eyes. The bride's lips parted slightly, and the groom's smile seemed to stretch imperceptibly. The shadow behind them shifted like smoke, curling toward the corners of the frame. He scribbled furiously in his notebook, the words flowing from a mind caught between fear and fascination, describing the photograph as alive, not in flesh but in presence, as though it was aware of the gaze that fell upon it. The bidders felt unease settling in their chests. Their hands began to sweat, their pulses racing. Some averted their eyes too quickly, fearing what might linger in the corner of their vision. Others felt a pull toward the frame that they could not resist, and the journalist wrote that it was as if the photograph itself chose who could look and who would be warned. He saw a man tremble in front of the pedestal and step back sharply, muttering words under his breath as if warding off some unseen force, and all around the room the air grew heavier, thicker, almost pressing against skin and lungs. The chandelier lights flickered and shadows leapt in ways that defied the structure of the room. Then the bidding began, a tense quiet that seemed unnatural spread across the hall. Each raise of the paddle felt like a heartbeat in a chamber of suspense. The photograph watched silently, yet its presence was palpable. Every time someone reached to bid, they felt a subtle vibration across the floor, and a whisper so faint it was almost imagined crawling into the corners of the mind, warning them to be careful of the price not measured in pounds, but in consequence. For every raise, the journalist noticed subtle changes in the image, the groom's smile widening imperceptibly, and the bride's eyes following the bidders with intent that grew heavier. With every passing minute, the shadow behind them shifted closer, and the air around the pedestal seemed colder, drawing shivers along spines. At the climax of the auction, when the final hammer was about to fall, a fire erupted in the back of the hall, flames licking the curtains and smoke rolling over the bidders, forcing them to scramble for exits. Yet amidst the chaos, the pedestal remained untouched, the photograph safe as if protected by the very forces that haunted it. The auction house burned nearly to the ground. The floorboards blackened, the walls charred, yet the frame and its contents emerged untouched, intact, its presence unbroken, its eyes unblinking in the smoke and heat. The journalist later wrote that he could feel the photograph observing the flames drawing strength from the destruction around it, almost as if it had anticipated the night and ensured its survival. Those who survived swore the photograph had chosen to remain unharmed for a purpose unknown, perhaps to continue its watch, perhaps to claim its next victim, or perhaps to bear witness to the folly of curiosity. The secret auction was never spoken of openly. The burned auction house became abandoned, and the photograph disappeared once again, slipping into obscurity until it surfaced decades later. And each time it reappeared, the legend grew. The stories of movement, breathing eyes, smiling shadows, spreading among collectors and onlookers, became more detailed, more terrifying. And so in 1974, the photograph survived fire, its curse intact, its presence unshaken, a witness untouchable and eternal, a reminder that some objects carry more than history. They carry consciousness, memory, and intent that cannot be destroyed. And the eyes of the bride and groom in the frame with the shadow behind them bore witness to the chaos and destruction, ensuring that anyone who dared come near would understand that the photograph was not to be trifled with, that it lived not only in glass and silver nitrate, but in the minds and fears of all who encountered it. Today, the wedding photograph's location is unknown. It has vanished into shadow like it has a will of its own, slipping from auction houses, from private collections, from attics and vaults, as if it knows when someone seeks it out. Yet a final letter from its last known owner has surfaced, a letter that chills the blood of anyone who reads it. Its words written in a hurried hand, trembling as if the writer had felt the presence of the photograph upon him, even while putting pen to paper. The letter begins with a warning that this is not merely a photograph, that it carries within it something far older than paper and glass, something alive and aware, something that observes and remembers, and that those who look into its eyes are never truly unseen. The owner wrote that from the moment he laid eyes upon the frame, he felt a pressure in the room, a weight that pressed against his chest and his mind, as though the couple in the photograph had reached out through time to measure him, assess him, judge him. He described the bride's eyes following him constantly, even when the frame was turned away, or covered, a presence that seemed to seep through walls, that whispered his name in the quiet hours of the night. The groom's smile widened. Imperceptibly as days passed, it seemed to grow sharper. More knowing, the shadow behind them pulsed with energy, with intent, almost as if it were alive. A witness, not content merely to observe, but to record and act. And the owner admitted he could feel it, learning about him, studying him, memorizing every breath, every thought. He wrote that the photograph was a doorway, a threshold, not between rooms, but between worlds, between life and something beyond life. The couple and the shadow behind them were not confined to the glass. They could see into the minds of those who gazed upon them. They could reach into memories, plant doubts, extract fears, and the owner confessed that even now, when he wrote these words, he could feel eyes upon him that were not his own, that weighed and measured, and knew that he had looked into them, and therefore had become marked. The simple act of observation had bound him to the photograph, its doorway open, and he a participant unwillingly in whatever game it played. The letter went on to describe nights of terror. He could barely sleep. He heard whispers from corners of rooms, voices calling names familiar and yet wrong, as if the shadow of the hidden figure spoke in imitation of those he loved. He described dreams where he walked through foggy streets, where the bride and groom appeared in windows, staring out, mouths moving. but silent eyes fixed upon him, and the shadow flickering behind their forms, growing larger, smaller, closer, farther, always present. Always aware, he tried to leave the city. He tried to abandon the photograph, but reports came that it had been returned. Somehow appeared again, as though it had a life of its own, choosing its host and place. Had Willie begged anyone reading to understand that the photograph was not to be sought after? It was not merely cursed, it was aware, it was patient, and it was waiting for the next person to glance too long to linger, too curious to realize that once seen, it had already seen you. It remembered. You, it recorded your presence, and your name was now etched into the awareness of the bride, the groom, and the hidden figure behind them, and the owner swore that those who continued to look would be drawn into it, into its doorway, into whatever shadowed place it existed in beyond the boundaries of time and matter. The letter concluded with a final chilling statement that summed the horror succinctly. It isn't just a photo, it's a doorway. And once you've looked into their eyes, they already know your name. The last owner wrote that he could feel it knowing him. Even as he sealed the envelope, he could sense the eyes pressing against the back of his mind, and that the shadow pulsed in acknowledgement of the mark the photograph had placed upon him, and he warned that it did not forget. It did not forgive, and it never released what it claimed. And the letter was discovered years later in a locked drawer in a library. The pages yellowed, the ink still legible, and those who read it felt the same weight, the same cold dread, as if the photograph itself were present, watching from afar through time and space. Today the photograph remains missing. No one knows where it is or who holds it. Some say it waits in some private collection. Some say it roams the globe seeking its next observer. Others whisper that it hides in plain sight, appearing briefly in old houses or antique shops, only to vanish when anyone reaches for it. But the letter remains a testament to its power to observe, to remember, to mark, and to bind. And to this day the warning echoes that looking into the eyes of the bride and groom and the shadow behind them is not a choice. It is a contract signed in observation, a debt unpaid until the viewer is drawn into the doorway themselves. And so the legend persists, the photograph now more than a relic, a witness, a curse and a doorway. All at once a presence beyond paper and glass, beyond place and time, waiting patiently for the next gaze, for the next hand, for the next soul who dares to meet the eyes of James and Eleanor, and the figure that lurks behind them, and to know that once seen it knows your name, and perhaps your fate.